Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at World War II on the home front, and specifically looking at how World War I and World War II have quite a few similarities when it comes to the mobilization of the American people, but also investigating how different groups of people are going to make gains that are going to be much longer lasting after the end of this conflict. So we've spoken about total war in an earlier time period, but ultimately this idea of how do we mobilize the civilian population towards this goal of victory. And you can see that we have two political cartoons. The one that's on the left here is from World War II. The one that's on the right is from World War I. But you can see that they're both geared towards this idea of women making some sort of commitment towards the war effort. And in this one, we're looking at food. We don't see food today, or the production of food, as necessarily a patriotic act, but certainly in both wars, it was communicated to women that by growing their own food in their backyards, by canning and preserving that food, therefore they don't have to buy food that's on the larger market that can be then geared towards the war effort. But again, these are just some simple posters that would have been seen in, local supermarkets, outside of those stores. They may have even appeared, near churches and other civic buildings to encourage women who weren't fighting the war directly to take action that ultimately was seen as benefiting the war effort. The propaganda of World War II, very similar to World War I in that the use of posters to communicate ideas on a whole different range of concepts, whether that is women gaining some sort of greater role in the workforce, particularly in war industries, buying war bonds in order to support the war effort. We can see the famous Rosie the Riveter, but she also had her counterpart who was Benny the Bungler. And he, in this instance, likes to talk, and maybe he's talking about something that he saw at work that really shouldn't be expressed to the larger public because it might benefit the enemy if they know about it. Even cartoons, characters like Donald Duck are not going to be seen as much in popular entertainment. The artists that created them are actually going to be focused on creating propaganda and training material. So this Donald Duck Gets Drafted is part of a whole series of comic books and cartoon movies that were geared to the American soldier, so that they could have training in an entertaining way. But there will be film, radio shows in order to raise money for things like Liberty Bonds, live entertainment. Come see a show for no cost. The expectation is when you end, you put over $5, $10, maybe $25 that will later be used not only for the war effort, but perhaps 10, 20 years down the road, you'll get back at least what you paid and perhaps even twice the original principal. But this propaganda is going to be powerful, much like our Committee of Public Information in World War I. We have the Office of War Information that's created in 1942 to oversee all of this. Women took on much greater roles outside the home in World War I, and we see the same thing in World War II. Rosie the Riveter wasn't simply an idea, but women were working in war industries. These women are actually riveting sheet steel to the side of what will be the fuselage of a future plane. More than 19 million people are going to be employed, and those women, 37%, are going to represent a pretty large portion of the American population. Even in World War I, still employment for women was somewhere around 20%. So this is quite an increase. Over 6 million of these women are going to work specifically in war industries, meaning they're working in factories, they are building the ships, the airplanes, the munitions that are needed to fight this war. More than 350,000 women are going to be part of the armed forces. Now, again, this is in non-combat roles, but it's going to go beyond just simply the nursing that was seen, the majority of women participating in World War I, but roles that men would be taking on in the military stateside, especially things like clerks and drivers, even pilots. There are going to be women trained to do those things. So this image of Rosie the Riveter, right, is quite iconic. Most people are familiar with it, even if they don't realize its connection to World War II. But it's important to see that the artist here used red, white, and blue quite intentionally. Also, we're seeing a modification of Republican motherhood. That idea coming out of the American Revolution that women instill the values of democracy, liberty, for future generations. We can see that in committing herself to working in the factory and working in a war industry, Rosie here is also communicating the values and actually being a part of that value system in her work. This poster you saw in an earlier presentation, I think it's important to bring it back again, that FDR spoke about the four freedoms. He gave a speech in which he said that we're not just simply fighting for things like freedom of speech and freedom of worship, which are obviously not just American values, but democratic values that perhaps much of the world embraces. And they are antithetical to what we're seeing with the rise of fascism. And other authoritarian regimes elsewhere in the world at this time. But also these ideas of freedom from want, so people to be not hungry, for people to have employment, to not be afraid of what the future may hold, but believe that there is opportunity around every corner, that those are also integral for a democratic society. And so as we look at other groups within American society on the home front, it's important to also look to what degree did these people experience greater democracy or perhaps see greater curbs on their freedoms during World War II. The Double V for Victory campaign was based in this idea that for African Americans, there were two things at stake, that they weren't simply going to commit themselves to fighting like they did in World War I and return to no progress. So the Double V campaign is going to be focused on this idea that racism is going to be ending at home and that fascism is going to be conquered abroad. And we're going to see that there are some positive movements towards this. At the beginning of the war, African American males were not allowed to be in combat roles whatsoever. And groups like the Tuskegee Airmen, who were not necessarily young men who had gained degrees at Tuskegee, but they were college-educated African-American males who were looking to become the engineers and pilots for the United States Army. They were not allowed to go to combat. They were going to be used to train white pilots, and they were also going to be used to repair and recondition existing aircraft. And it's going to be people like Eleanor Roosevelt. She's going to be a very powerful figure in this time period because she's often going to be able to go and champion for groups that perhaps her husband was unwilling or felt it was not politically well thought to take on those controversial ideas. But she actually visited the Tuskegee Airmen. She brought people from the newspapers to cover her presence there. She actually went up in a plane to demonstrate that her belief in that these men were doing something that was worthy and should have greater recognition, and they should have a bigger role in fighting this war. And that did succeed. She was able to get the Tuskegee Airmen to be part of the 1st Division of the Army that allowed African American pilots to fight in combat. The vast majority of African American males, however, were still in non-combat roles. Even if they were put in the infantry, they were often, or artillery, they were often focused on bringing supplies. But those supply lines will become crucial for bringing a close, especially to the war in Europe. A group known as the Red Ball Express, these men were all African American soldiers who were responsible for the supply line from the D-Day landing in Normandy all the way to the conclusion of the war in Germany when Berlin falls in May of 1945. Much of their work was incredibly dangerous. They had to drive at night without lights. They were constantly attempting to thwart German aircraft that were attempting to attack these convoys. In December of 1944, much of this supply line ended up being caught behind enemy lines in the Battle of the Bulge and actually became combat troops. So it was a demonstration that African Americans were willing to commit and were as brave as any white soldier serving on the front lines. But it will not be until 1948, with the Truman presidency, after the war is over, that we will begin to see the integration of the armed forces, black and white. They are still segregated in this time period. And even gentlemen like the Tuskegee Airmen, to some degree, had white officers overseeing their work. In the civilian portion of the war, we're going to see that African Americans, even by 1943, are still being employed at much lower rates than whites. And when they are, they're also paid far less. A. Philip Randolph, who was the director of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, will go on to do work with the NAACP for the purposes of bringing greater equity when it comes to pay and also jobs in war industries. And will get, under threat of extensive protest, FDR will agree by executive order to command that all people working in war industries, regardless of race, be paid the same wage. And so Executive Order 8802 is going to be the beginnings of what will become many other laws to be in the civil rights era about equal pay, regardless of race or ethnicity. And we can look at some pictures here and we can see that there are definitely elements of progress, that African Americans are certainly seen as being able to fight closer on the front lines. Economic parity between black and white. In war industries, we have African American women who are also serving in the military. But there are some limits. As you notice, this is a segregated unit. We're not seeing integration in the military at this time. And we're also not seeing the sense that African Americans are part and parcel to American life in an equal respect without the intervention of the government, that is still necessary in order to affect change. Native Americans, for the first time, are going to be drafted. So in 1917, Native Americans were still not considered citizens. That won't happen until 1924. But by 1941, they are considered American citizens. And so when the Selective Service Act goes into effect in December of 1941, we will see Native Americans who are drafted and many others who will volunteer to go and fight. They will not serve in segregated units, in part because they are now citizens and live within the United States, regardless of whether it's on the reservation system or off of it. They were no longer seen as a group that was not part of the larger American culture. Although obviously socially there were still a great deal of limits. One of the big effects this will have is that until 1941, the vast majority of Native Americans lived on the reservation system that had been created in the late 19th century. One of the great ironies is that many people will not only leave that system through this experience of fighting in the war, but that something that will be integral to the success in the Pacific, what was known as the Navajo Code Talkers, will be something that Navajo people wouldn't actually be allowed to do on the reservation system in the 1940s, and that is speak their native language. In order to fight the war in the Pacific, there was a desire to have a code that could be unbreakable by the Japanese, that it was one in which even if you captured a soldier, they would not be able to actively help the enemy solve it. And so the Navajo language was used because it was an oral language. It was not written down. A specific population of people were speakers of it. And in some cases, you had Navajo men who had heard these words from their childhood but may not have actually gained the competency to speak that language until they had had the training for the purposes of serving in the Pacific. But the U.S. Marine Corps will credit much of their success, especially with island hopping and the capture of Iwo Jima, to these code talkers who are going to be able to help move troops and work against the Japanese there. One of the sad notes that come out of World War II is the treatment of people who were of Japanese ancestry. And we have looked throughout this course at the simple fact that from the 1880s well until the 1930s, Japanese Americans, Korean and Chinese Americans felt that they not only were segregated within American society, especially in the West where many had settled, but also the exclusion of those people, beginning in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, with the Gentleman's Agreement in 1904, 1905 with Japan, and certainly limits on Korean immigration by 1907 with the National Origins Act of 1924, all Asiatic immigration stops. Why this is important? Because it contributes to the view that Asiatic peoples cannot assimilate, that they are not a part of the larger American culture, that they live outside of it. Executive Order 9066, which is responsible for the internment of not just Japanese people, but also some Germans and Italian Americans, but primarily, as you can see by these numbers, Japanese Americans, was considered lawful. Again, it's an executive order, so this is an extension of presidential power, but it was argued and lobbied for by mostly elected officials from California, Oregon, and Washington State. Congress as a whole was unwilling to commit internment across the board. If they were going to intern people, particularly those who were second generation Americans, it just seemed untenable to do that. And so by executive order, it was decided that within the continental United States, there would be this incarceration of people who could potentially be enemies to the United States. The great irony is that Japanese people living in Hawaii, which was the largest population of Japanese Americans in the United States at that time, did not face internment. It was only those living within the 48 states of the continental U.S. 10 camps in total were created for Japanese internment, the largest being in Manzanar, California. Most of these people will lose their homes and businesses. They will be forced to leave. They can only carry so much luggage with them. How is this different from what happened to dispossessed people in Europe, for instance, like Jews living in Germany and German-occupied portions of Europe? Well, a few differences. One, these were not death camps, and they weren't actually work camps either. That there was this sense that people were going to be removed, that it was going to be for a limited time, that the people who lived there were ultimately responsible for much of their own food production and education, but that there was this idea that they would one day, when the war was over, return to their homes. But if you leave your business for 3 years, you're probably not coming back to it. For many of these people, they were forced to leave their homes. If they held a mortgage on it, they couldn't pay on it, they lost their home. And so there was really no understanding that you were breaking up people's lives, that you were ultimately putting them on a trajectory of losing everything that they had successfully acquired for themselves. This movement by 1944 will be seen as unconstitutional, but there will be several cases that will go before the Supreme Court before that decision is finally made. The first of those decisions, Korematsu v. U.S. Korematsu was an American, Japanese American, who actually was living in Kentucky at the time. He received a letter saying that he was to register in his county as a Japanese American, and then it would be decided whether he would be forced to relocate. He refused to go and register himself. And in refusing to comply, he found himself under arrest. He attempted to thwart this executive order by saying it was unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court said that at a time of war, the Fifth Amendment does not apply in the same way that it does not in a time of war, and that Korematsu ultimately violated a executive order that he had to comply to. Had he complied to it, then perhaps the constitutional issues could have then been examined. But his lack of compliance essentially made his suit null and void. Endo v. U.S. has a very different outcome. So the Endo in this case was a young woman who was a second generation Japanese American, and she argued that her incarceration was wrong because she was a loyal citizen. She was born in the United States. She was a citizen of the United States. She had never been arrested. She was actually 16 when she was first relocated. And she argued that over the course of the 3 years of her confinement, she had never violated any law before or during that time. And therefore, the executive order itself was unconstitutional because as a citizen of the United States who had never demonstrated any sort of treason or sedition, she was being punished as if she had committed those things. And the Supreme Court ruled in her favor, and at that point, those programs began to be dismantled. However, making people whole again won't happen for a very long time. In 1989, the U.S. government would pay reparations of $20,000 to each person who had been interned during World War II and were given a written apology signed by George H.W. Bush on behalf of the American government. Mexican Americans. So we've looked at the U.S.'s relationship with Mexico over the course of U.S. history thus far. But Mexican Americans are going to be both welcomed but also maligned in this time period. By the beginning of 1942, it is seen that there is ultimately not enough workers, particularly in terms of agriculture, as a result of the war and the need to bring men into the Army and to be working towards further industrial capacity. And so the United States government reaches out to Mexico, and in some ways kind of an extension of the good neighbor policy, but says that we are looking for contract labor and begin something known as the Bracero program. That program will last for more than 20 years, and more than 5 million Mexicans will come to the United States. Many will actually stay, but it started out as ultimately a migrant labor program specifically for the purposes of during times of agricultural harvest. So many people coming into the United States in a short period of time, we are going to begin to see, particularly in larger cities like Los Angeles. That area, the San Fernando Valley, had throughout the 1930s been growing in terms of the number of farms and agricultural production in the United States. So many of these Bracero contract laborers went to that area. In Los Angeles, it was also a time where the Port of Los Angeles is one of the biggest in this country. It was the point of embarkation for many young soldiers and men serving in the Navy who were looking to go fight in the Pacific. And culturally, Mexican Americans, there was some language differences in some cases, certainly music, and that if you were a migrant laborer as a part of this Bracero program, you were not going to be drafted. You were not someone who could volunteer to go and fight in the Army. And so you, when you weren't working, did have leisure time. You would be a young man out of uniform, which was very rare. Being 4F, which was a medical designation saying you could not go fight in the army, to some young men, culturally was so devastating. There was a pretty high suicide rate in the early years of the war when young men were called into service or went to volunteer and could not be accepted because they had some physical issue that would prevent them from being in active duty. And so to have young men who were not in uniform, were not serving in any kind of military capacity, they stood out. Also, the fashion of the time up until the war began was for baggier coats and pants. With wartime rationing in America, civilian clothing became a much smaller silhouette. Women's skirts became shorter and much tighter, including men's jackets and women's jackets also were made with less material. And so these young men were wearing what was the leisure time fashion of the late 1930s, which would become known as the zoot suit. And you can see this soldier, his outfit that he's wearing certainly consumed a lot less fabric, because also the military does not wish to waste in that time. And you had a community of people who were sort of primed that anyone who was dressed like this was dressed in an un-American way. The LA Times, which was the largest newspaper then and now, and had a very large circulation even beyond the Los Angeles area, published an article about how to de-zoot a zoot suiter, speaking about confronting these people, perhaps even stripping them of their clothes. And by June of 1943, you will have on and off almost a month full of riots known as the Zoot Suit riots. And it's primarily white moms, often men on leave from military duty, walking around the streets of LA with clubs, and mass beatings and stripping of Mexican Americans. Again, this is going to be an issue that Eleanor Roosevelt is going to jump on and condemn, but it's not going to be prosecuted by the state of California and certainly not by the federal government. And it really does illustrate that there was an acceptable level of prejudice against this group in this time period. And it's going to be something that's going to continue to marginalize Mexican Americans, particularly in the West, for many years to come. So as we close out, three things I want you to consider. The first one is, in what ways did World War II impact daily life for the majority of Americans? And we've broken it by subgroup as well, so you can get a better sense of how different groups are going to see achievement, but also struggle to overcome the prejudices in American life that existed in the 1940s. Second, to what extent did World War II have positive impact on women and other minority groups? And then the third is, how did ethnicity, race, gender limit these groups to achieving real equality during the World War II era? And it's something that we need to be looking at as we get into the post-war portion of this course. What is it going to take? What are going to be the specific developments that are going to take whatever achievements we do see in this World War II time period and normalize them in peacetime and make them part of American culture, long-standing, not just anomalies within times of war and conflict, when co-opting those groups would somehow benefit the country as a whole, but we don't see long-lasting success for those groups after that period of time.